speak a bit about the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. I will start with that caveat that I even had yesterday. I was not directly involved in the project. I've done a fair amount of research on it, written a few articles on the adaptive management program, including one with Todd, or a couple with Todd and Larry this time. And so, as part of that, we did some interviewing with the chief mediator and some of the agency officials, some of the other stakeholders involved. So we have a pretty good sense of how the process worked. The Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program, very long name. It's a complex long-term project. It's been around for about 17 years and counting. So the management of the Colorado River, which is where the Glen Canyon Dam is, and then the management of the Glen Canyon Dam has been governed even before the Glen Canyon Dam by a set of conflicting laws. One of the big sets of the laws are the laws of the river. It's called the Law of the River, which is sort of a suite of statutes, regulations, court decisions, sort of state compacts about water usage, as well as a suite of other laws as well dealing with hydropower, but also by another suite of environmental laws or natural resource laws, most prominently the Endangered Species Act. And there's essentially been a long-standing conflict over uses of the river and of the dam. The primary interests were involving hydropower, water delivery, sort of water consumption and use, ecological and recreational. And just as a piece to give people a general sense that Colorado provides water to 7 U.S. states and Mexico, the dam generates the equivalent of about 11 million barrels of oil and power. It has about 8 endangered species that are immediately downstream from the dam, and 3 additional threatened species. And there's a bunch of recreational rafting and fishing going on there. So as a result after a fair amount of legal and political disputes over the river, eventually the U.S. Congress stepped in, believe it or not, to enact the Grand Canyon Protection Act in 1992. That statute stipulated that the agency that was primarily in charge of the dam, the Bureau of Reclamation, the Department of Interior, to get various different stakeholders together to consult regarding dam operations, and included a list of the different entities that should be including federal agencies, some states, power generators, the recreational users, and the environmental organizations. And it also required an EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, under the National Environmental Policy Act. And a few years later, in 1995, the EIS recommended the use of adaptive management because of significant uncertainties regarding the dam's effects on some of the ecological systems downstream. And so the Department of Interior, Bruce Babbitt was the secretary at the time, decided to create this adaptive management program to further the EIS's recommendation and to carry out its duties under the Grand Canyon Protection Act. Essentially to monitor the operation of the dam, to operate the dam in compliance with the range of laws and regulations, and to mitigate any significant environmental impacts. That's what the statute said. So there are various different components of the adaptive management program. Just to, again, a quick overview of them. The main body is the Adaptive Management Working Group, which is a formal federal advisory committee whose charter was signed in 1997. And it includes basically 4 federal agencies: the Bureau of Reclamation, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Western Area Power Administration, and the power purchasers, 2 power purchasers, the 7 states that are the basin states for the river, 2 environmental groups, 2 recreational groups, and 6 tribes. That's the composition of the AMWIC, the Adaptive Management Working Group. They are governed by a variety of different rules that they adopted. I think the 2 primary ones that people here would probably want to know about are obviously that, first of all, they are governed by the Robert's Rules of Order, and the second one is about their decision rule. It's a consensus decision rule, but there's a caveat that says unless the chair, which is the Secretary of Interior, the designee, the Secretary's designee, unless the chair deems that's impossible, and then it reverts to a 2/3 majority. That's the AMWIC, the overall group that's in charge of the AMP. Then there's also a technical working group, which is made up of technical representatives from each of the AMWIC group. And their job is primarily to develop questions for the design of monitoring and research by the GCMRC, the Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center, which I'll talk about in a second. So they develop the questions for the design of the monitoring and research, basically the research program. They have other jobs as well, but that's their primary goal, their primary job regarding fact-finding. Then there's the GCMRC, which is part of the U.S. Geological Survey. So it's actually part of a federal agency. That's how it was set up. Their job is primarily to explore research questions posed by the AMWIC, typically through the technical working group. And most famously, some of you may have heard of them, maybe not, it's not that famous. They've conducted a variety of different experiments on the dam. So every once in a while you'll see these massive bursts, every few years or so, massive bursts of experimental flows, high flow of the river that analyzes the effects on the ecosystems downstream. The Colorado River, it means actually pink, it means it's murky. The river used to be a very murky, muddy river, but after the dam basically keeps a lot of the sediment upstream, and the river now below the dam essentially is really cold, and it's much colder than it has been in the past before the dam was created, and it's very clear. It's the opposite of Colorado in that sense. And as a result, it's had some impacts on the native ecosystems, and there was a real concern that invasive species were going to proliferate quite a bit downstream to the detriment of the native species. So these high flow experiments were intended to test out to what extent, how much of a regime, a modified low flow regime, would be necessary or appropriate, that would be most effective for protecting the native species downstream, but also less likely to lead to some proliferation of the invasive species. We've got the AMP, which as part of the program, you've got the overall stakeholder group, you've got a technical working group, which are each representative of the AMWIG has a member on, and then there's this GCMRC, which is part of the U.S. Geological Survey, and they're the entity that is given the job of carrying out the research that essentially the TWIG sets aside, the technical working group sets aside for them to do. At least that's the way it's supposed to work in theory. The last group that's also another sort of entity is the independent review panels. That includes like a science advisory board, which is essentially plays the role of peer review. They assess the GCMRC's proposals and their experiments to ensure objectivity and credibility. So this overall program has an annual operating budget of about $11 million. So I'll start with a couple sort of positives in the context of fact-finding in the AMP. First of all, I think it is certainly a positive. The stakeholder-comprised technical working group has the capacity to formulate researchable questions. I mean, that's obviously a positive, that they set the stage of what the questions are supposed to be. Another piece that I think is important, the GCMRC, that the expert, if you will, is a very well-funded scientific monitoring and research apparatus. So it has the resources and objectivity, at least vis-a-vis the stakeholders, to play a major role in sort of conducting and managing the research process. But most of what I have to say about the AMP is somewhat critical. So I'm hoping that some of these some of the lessons that might come from that might give us a sense of when joint fact-finding is useful. Again, I'm going to set aside any of the critiques that I and my co-authors have had regarding other aspects, but just focusing on the joint fact-finding part of it. The first piece is that I'd say the AMP, this might be the overarching problem with the AMP, although I should say the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program is held out by a lot of people as sort of a great example of adaptive management, of collaborative management. So some of the critiques I have, it comes in line, unfortunately, with a lot of the critiques that happen with collaborative adaptive management, is that they're great in theory, and the question is how do we get them to work as best as possible in practice. But the first one is that really that the program is just not giving clear direction regarding the goals or mandate of the program. So Congress, through the Grand Canyon Protection Act, did a classic legislative punt, which is the whole idea of that act was to sort of essentially I think for many it's held out as a way to navigate the different conflicting priorities regarding managing the river. But if you actually look at what the statute says, it acts like you can do everything. It basically says, hydropower is incredibly important, protecting water use for downstream rivers, downstream states to get their allocation, protecting the ecosystem. These are all really important stuff, and doesn't actually give any prioritization regarding the competing uses. So it just merely restates that they're all important. And as a result, perhaps it's unsurprising that the agency itself hasn't really given prioritization either. And so, to me, one of the things that I think is to be drawn from that is, to a certain extent, you want the group to be able to fashion their own questions in developing the joint fact-finding. But the challenge often is if you leave it so open that you leave the parties with their conflicting interests without any sort of guidance on how to manage the different priorities, you end up having a big fight over the priorities, but just through the joint fact-finding process. This is, again, sort of merging the question. If you aren't able to separate values from facts, you end up having a fight over the values, masked through the context of the facts.
Bruce, you were saying that's what you were talking about.
Another sort of thing that we saw is that the AMP does not provide any clear guidance establishing sort of chain of command between the AMWAG, the main umbrella organization, or the technical working group, and the Glen Canyon Monitoring and Research group. So the expert and the group that it was supposed to report to didn't have an obvious chain of command. It might seem like an obvious point, but in this program, the AMP does not give the AMWAG the authority and responsibility to identify research priorities. So they never developed a sort of a joint research protocol that was then given, that then they used as a basis for telling the TWIG and telling the GCMRC what to do research on, okay? So, and that combined with the fact that the GCMRC is responsible for providing data to the AMWAG and the TWIG, but is not under their direction. They are under the USGS. And so what you end up having is that, I mean, all GCMRC staff are government employees or contractors, and the AMWAG and TWIG members have no say regarding who the GCMRC hires or what sort of jobs they have to do. So you end up with a situation where arguments between the expert and the working group. So you get the expert saying, you guys are not giving us clear guidance on what to research. And the AMWAG is saying, you're not responsive to us. You're not being attentive to the group's requests. Except that they made arguments that they made unilateral decisions and changes to documents without the input of the AMWAG. So obviously we thought, and I think the design really cripples the AMWAG's ability to manage uncertainty regarding some of the central dams management questions. I think the same thing goes with the independent review panels. The independent review panels are hired by the GCMRC, and so they adopt sort of a peer review approach. But the problem is that at least some of the the AMWAG members, some of the stakeholders claim that the peer review is not as rigorous, or they're not as open about their critiques as they otherwise might be, because they're being hired by GCMRC and they want to keep getting more jobs from the GCMRC. So they're not going to be as critical as they might have otherwise been as a result. The last piece I think I want to point out is that these experiments, these sort of famous experiments that are out there that have been done, provide information, but they're not used sufficiently to really solve or address some of the problems that are being raised there. I mean, there's a lot of scientific uncertainty, and as a result, the GCMRC has done these experimental flood releases. But because the AMP members haven't really had a lot of input in crafting the research, what ends up happening is that they end up criticizing the findings. They criticize the interpretations of the impacts of the releases on downstream resources. They criticize the decisions of what the experiments should be conducted and when they should be conducted. They criticize decisions on how the impact should be measured. And they ended up disagreeing regarding what the ideal outcome would be. So you end up having these experiments that are being conducted, but the individual parties end up not disputing sort of the interpretations of the facts, but rather what the facts themselves are. And in part, I think it's pretty clear because they were not involved in actually crafting the research questions. So it's a related point that ends up, the joint fact-finding ends up being used in some sense as a delay tactic by some of the other stakeholders. So you end up with, because there's a lot of uncertainty, and everybody agrees there's a lot of uncertainty. And unfortunately, this is where the lawyer in me comes in, the sort of regulatory designer, is that the law is really silent on to what extent, once you've reduced uncertainty, at what point does it trigger a management change to occur? And a lot of the AMP was set up as a way of sort of managing uncertainty. But it's because they don't actually have a trigger that says, okay, now is time to actually change the management. It's been 17 years. This program's been around for 17 years, but they still have not changed the long-term. They have not changed it once, the long-term management regime. And it's a bit of an unusual example because, as I mentioned before, the experiments actually have ecological benefits. So when you do the experiment, you end up having a lot of sediment come through and actually is good for some native resources. What ends up happening is that the joint fact-finding process, the sort of experimentation process, has become the management regime. That every once in a while when you say, oh, the native resources are not doing so good, let's do another experiment. And the experiment, you learn stuff from the experiment. But one of the sort of side benefits of the experiment is that you're actually improving the native resources. So 17 years, and of course they now have approved a management plan through 2020. So it'll be 23 years or so of management, which is a joint fact-finding process. That is the actual management regime. They now have an EIS that they're drafting that should come out. The draft should come out this summer, which it looks at various different alternatives and how the long-term management will be. So maybe at some point they'll develop a long-term management regime. But it does raise the question, and I don't know how unique this is, where the joint fact-finding process becomes the regulatory process itself.
Let's take some questions. Questions, Todd?
Well, I just wanted to add a couple of things if I could. I mean, one is the AMP, understandably, is the dynamic part of the system, but has been focusing on the ecological part. But there's also interesting JFF questions that happened earlier around the cultural side. As Alex mentioned, there are the tribes involved, there's huge tribal heritage in that area, and there's also interesting parts around identifying, working with anthropologists and so on to identify, and elders, to identify, okay, what are the sort of key cultural elements and how can we protect those in the management regime. And the other thing to say, not unrelated in a way, is, that I think is interesting in a global sense is, there is an example here of how we have to be careful about heterogeneity within stakeholder groups. So a good example is the tribes. So you might think tribes would have some kind of shared vision of this. They don't at all in this case. Some of the tribes directly benefit from hydroelectricity production and so on there, and therefore are very supportive. And others that maybe feel more threatened, they're the ones with burial grounds down the Rainbow Arch and so on downstream, are more likely to be very opposed to hydroelectricity production continuing in the traditional flow pattern. The other would be the recreational users. You have people who raft, who have a certain set of desires for the management of the river, and then you have a trout fishery that is become a major industry in that area, and it's dependent on that cold, clean water.
The non-native fish actually, they need the non-native fish
Yeah.
for trout, yeah.
So the heterogeneity.
Other questions? Yeah, Jeff.
The term joint fact-finding is their term in this context? I mean, they use the term joint fact-finding for what is going on here?
I don't think so. I think they would call it adaptive management.
Call it
though
adaptive management.
That's butchering the term, that term as well. I mean, what exactly what they mean by that? But I'm not sure if there was a recognition that there was clearly value differences. But they also saw there was a lot of uncertainty. This gets back to one of your first slides here, is that I got the sense that the political powers that be decided that there's a lot of value difference, but maybe if we can figure out the factual differences, we will solve a lot of the problems. And what ends up happening is that the scientists see that there's always there's more uncertainty. Scientists want a 99% certainty before they say, okay, now we don't have uncertainty. Now we can make a new management regime. What ends up happening is 17 years later, they're still doing experiments, learning about the ecosystem, and they're learning things. I think that's one of the things that everybody agrees is the value that comes from this. They're learning a lot about what modified low flows work best and which ones don't, and what other management they can do. But it ends up, I don't know if it's paralysis or not. It's an unusual circumstance where the experiments actually have some ecosystem benefits, so the agencies are kind of using the experiments as a long-term management protocol.
Well, I would just add to that. I mean, I guess what I was trying to get to was if they aren't using the term, that's good because it hasn't been absconded in this circumstance and sown to run in eddies. The other, so to speak, and I guess the other thing is what's remarkable to me about it, and it's true about the national, infrastructure of environmental management, is this engagement with science and management is a pre-existing conversation. Is it able to translate into clear action and our expectations met from it or not? But the truth is, there is this effort to get to science and management in a similar sense. So, and I think that's something to build off of, whether you can, and so that's good to that.
Let me ask you, if you were the grand architect and the fixer of this system, you alluded to a few pieces that might be done differently. What changed? I think you've alluded to a few, but I'd love to hear you say, fine, if I was king for the day, if I was the mastermind of this, here's what I would change and tweak, or if we were starting over, here's what I'd do different.
Well, I think in the end, you end up with competing priorities, and I think it's pretty clear, even with the information uncertainty, that not all of them can be met. And so you need somebody, namely the legislature, to give you a sense of which of those different priorities.
But it's not gonna happen.
Yeah, they won't do it.
Well, but they are by de facto doing that, right? De facto they have by not doing it.
I think that's why these ecosystem projects are so
cumbersome.
is because no one will, because no one can.
No one can? What do you mean, no one can?
Well, they're gridlocked.
They're gridlocked. No one can make any of those priorities stick because they're all priorities. They really are all priorities.
The
So
question-
nobody can say that's a better priority.
The question is,
What can we dither along with is what the answer is.
I mean, I guess it's a roundabout way of getting to it, but when Janessa and I and Barbara were working in Papua New Guinea on this big mining question, it was, the question got framed as, what's the new balancing act?
Yep.
What's the next balancing act between, sustainability for communities and in the law, and there are some of their losses from these mine tailings, and economic development?
So
What's the new balance? What's the balance?
Right.
Well,
gotta
that
be?
would only be achieved by the people, the parties at the table.
Yeah.
Who are diverse.
So you couldn't get to a
in
final
negotiation.
ranking, but you could sort of say,
Versus.
is there a way of re-looking, take a fresh look at the balance?
For the
Balancing
moment, for some,
For 60,000 people.
for
up and
some
down the river.
10-year
19%
period
of
maybe.
that.
a sort of an agreement as to the prioritization at this moment.
No, I
Yeah.
wouldn't say prioritization, balancing it. We're gonna kind of oonch along like this, because I think it's hubris to think that we could come up with a program or a policy or a management regime or a thing that could manage these ecosystems, given the incredibly important and diverse priorities there are. It's just hubris. And before, we used to think you could do it technically and scientifically. And so we said to USGS, go do that. And then we said, okay, that's silly. So we thought we could do this thing called
As you said,
ecosystem.
that didn't work.
Yeah. So, and we thought we could do this thing called ecosystem management, and we could, bring management and values and science and blah, blah, blah. And the problem is that the ecosystem's too big, and we're too puny, and we don't have the political we don't have systems that work like that, political or legislative or legal systems that work at that scale, time frame or politically. So I think what's better is just to think, is there some way we can sort of like scooch along and not do any damage?
See, that doesn't, that's not satisfying for me.
Scooching or rooching?
And is that-
Scooching and unching.
I understand what you're saying.
Those are technical terms, scooching and
I think we can exchange that.
Scooching and ooching are technical, legal terms, yes.
Well, I agree with Alex, it doesn't, I think it's maybe fair to say it's not realistic we're gonna have a legislative solution, but the joint fact finding is only useful if there is some policy that comes out of it. What's happening here clearly is that there is data that's being produced,
Right.
and we now have a better sense of it's going to cost X amount of electricity loss. The big issue is when you when you manage the dam for the species, you're losing a lot of revenue, right? Because you're not, the benefit of hydroelectricity is of course that you can ramp it up quickly when power is expensive, run water over and then stop, right? And if we say, no, we're gonna have a flow regime that's better for species, you're losing that revenue. So somebody has to say, okay, we're willing to trade this much revenue, we'll subsidize the power firms to have a right to this revenue in such a way, right? Somebody has to make that policy choice.
Everybody's
But who
optimum
will?
solution
Well,
is suboptimum
somebody
for
has to.
somebody else.
Why
That's
is
the-
that?
Actually, I was interested in your experience. I know you and Jeff are interested in the water code. I sat on the water commission for a while, and there actually are priorities set.
Yeah, they are, in that code,
In that code. I mean, so it can be done. I
Yeah.
mean, they actually, ecosystem protection is number one. I mean, that trumps everything else.
And native rights.
Native rights and Hawaiian too, so there is hope. I mean, there is
But that's a
a
bounded
process, but
system.
I mean, certainly there are systems, that do put priorities in there, and it's not like having, our point was cabining the conversation in some way, providing some sort of direction to the group makes the joint fact-finding process useful. Otherwise, you end up with 20 years later, sort of limping along and nobody's happy. I guess you might say some of the parties are happier than they would have been under a regime that changed it somewhat, but it didn't, I think if we're trying to point out that joint fact-finding can be useful and a fruitful exercise, you have to be careful about putting out something that's 17 years long and hasn't actually come up with something.
Yes.
Yeah.